Okay, let's talk about this a little bit more, but in terms of inversions. Now, we've looked at inversions a bunch with chords, and even before that, we've looked at inversions with intervals. But I want to talk about inversions one more time, just talking about intervals. Kind of like what we did with the visual landmarks, I want to give you a couple quick tricks to identify intervals, inversions of intervals. So, 4 main points for this video. First, perfect intervals invert to perfect intervals. They're always perfect. Invert this interval, and remember, inverting means taking one note and reverse, changing the order is all it really means of the notes. So I'm either going to take this F and put it up an octave, or I'm going to take this C and put it down an octave. Either way, a perfect fifth is going to stay a perfect interval. So if this F goes up to a C, if this F goes up an octave, now my interval is a fourth, because a fifth inverts to a fourth, but it's still a perfect interval, because a perfect fifth inverts to a perfect fourth. Perfect interval is a perfect interval. If I do that the other way, and I take the C down an octave, now again I have a perfect fourth, because a perfect fifth inverts to a perfect fourth. It stays perfect. What about an octave? An octave is a perfect interval, right? We just learned that. What happens if I invert an octave? I get a unison, which is also perfect, by the way, right? Because if I take one of these notes and I put it down an octave, I get a unison. I take this one and put it up an octave, I get a unison. So unison is also a perfect interval. Important to remember. Okay, point number 2. Major intervals invert to minor intervals. So here's a major third. If I invert this by taking this F and putting it up here, I now have a minor sixth. Okay, so if it was major and you invert it, it's now minor. Always. Always a major interval inverted becomes a minor interval. Let's look at an interval of a seventh. This is a major seventh. If I invert it, let's take this E down an octave. I now have a minor second, because an inversion of a seventh becomes a second, and it was major, so now it's minor. Okay, so if a major interval, whenever you invert a major interval, it turns into a minor interval. That's point 2. Point 3, the opposite is always true. Minor intervals invert to major intervals. Let's do something a little out of key here. Let's do a minor seventh, right? I lowered that, so now we have a minor seventh here. If I invert that, what we're going to have is I take that E flat down an octave. What we now have is a major second, E flat to F. That's a whole step apart, which is a major second. So minor intervals invert to major intervals. Okay, and the last trick, and this is an important one, this has to do with the numbers, right? So the way a seventh inverts to a second, a fifth inverts to a fourth, a sixth inverts to a third. Here's how you remember what inverts to what. Take the two numbers, they got to add up to 9. It's just kind of a weird mathematical thing. Let's go down here. A fifth. If I'm going to invert a fifth and I just want to know what it's going to end up on, 5 plus what equals 9? The answer is 4. So a fifth inverts to a fourth. If I take a sixth and I want to say, if I invert that, what's going to be my interval? 6 plus what equals 9? The answer is 3. So it's going to end up being a third. The two intervals just mathematically always add up to 9. Now don't get that confused with adding up to a ninth, the interval of a ninth. That's not true. It's just a numbers game here, not an intervals game. 5 inverts to 4 because that equals 9. 6 inverts to 3 because that equals 9. It's just a mathematical thing. Okay, so remember those things about inversions and you will be in good shape.